let's look at adding some more controls to the form we created in the last tutorial. Open up HP 9-1, and before our buttons, let's just add a couple of line break, or just press enter a couple of times. We're going to work below the email input. Okay, one common form control that we have are checkboxes. Checkboxes allow us to select more than one item. Let's say this newsletter is about animals. So let's say choose animals you like. And we'll add a break there. Checkboxes are created again by using the input tag. The type is checkbox. And there's several attributes that we need to be aware of for the checkbox. And these are very similar to the radio button that we're going to do in a moment. So I really do encourage you to look on page 406 of your book and get familiar with some of these attributes. So we can have, just like with our form tag, an ID, a name. These are really useful when it comes to back-end processing of your form, and then also when it comes to JavaScript. We can also give it a value. The value, again, is important when processing your form, because you checking the checkbox itself does not tell the server that processes the form what that value is. So I'll explain that in just a minute. Let's add a value to this so we kind of understand what I'm talking about. Let's say our first checkbox is going to be for cats, because y'all know I'm a cat person. So I'm going to give it a name of cat and an ID of cat. And again, remember, there needs to be only one ID on this form that has cat. And then let's have the actual word cat. And I'm just going to add a break there. Let's see what this looks like. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now we have this checkbox here. Okay. So me selecting as a user, selecting this checkbox does not tell the server what I'm selecting. Adding a value of cat would do so. Or oftentimes it's yes, because that's what's selected. Okay. Let's see, there's also a tab index we'll talk about later. You can make it required where the user has to select that. And then you could do a value of checked. We'll talk more about these later, okay? Let's add another one for a dog. And then another one, you can do an animal of your choice. I'll do a rabbit. Let's add a couple of extra breaks, so we'll have a few breaks before our buttons. And then let's refresh it to look. Oh, you just saw my email. Refresh it to look at it in the browser. Okay, so a checkbox allows you to select multiple options. You could select technically all three. You could select none as long as it's not required, or you could just select one. That is the difference between a checkbox and a radio button. So we're going to talk about radio buttons next, but this is a checkbox. Now this will appear slightly different on different browsers. So try checking your code in Firefox or Safari and see the differences in the way that your checkboxes and other form controls appear. Okay, after that, let's try adding some radio buttons. For this, let's say choose your grade, because radio buttons should only allow us to have one selection. Input type for a radio button is a radio. Now for this to be a valid radio control, like a group of radio buttons that are grouped together should always have the same name. If they don't have the same name, it would allow the user to select more than one. And we don't want them to do that. That defeats the purpose of a radio button. All right, you see where I'm going with this? We're going to do one for each grade. I guess I could put 11th. And add a couple of breaks after that, just so we'll have some extra spacing. Okay, so when we refresh in the browser, now we have radio buttons. So radio buttons should not allow us to select more than one, unlike checkboxes. But if we had not set these names the same, it would still allow us to do that. That's because in a form, you may have different groups of radio buttons. You may have several groups of radio buttons, and you don't want the browser to restrict that ability. You as the coder have to restrict that ability by making sure the name of associated radio buttons are all the same. Okay, what if we wanted to have a secret password? Ooh. Okay, so let's do enter your password. And we'll do input type equals, did you guess it? Password. Let's do a name of P word and an ID of P word. And if we look at this in the browser, it's going to look, oh, I forgot to add those little extra line breaks. Later we'll do the line breaks with CSS, but for right now we're just looking at the form. Okay. So it looks just like a normal text box, but look what happens when I type my password. So it hides the password. So there is input type password that allows you to have a text box that will mask the characters that the user enters. There is also an input type hidden, and that is a text box that does not appear to the user. Ooh, weird, huh? It just is sent to the backend processing. All right, one more in this tutorial. Let's look at a scrolling text box. A scrolling text box allows you to create a text box that the user can enter lots of lines of text. So maybe we want something that the user is going to enter their feedback, our comments, or something like that. And let's do a break here. Now, you would think input type text area, but you would be wrong. The inputs work for radio, checkboxes, and some other things, but for a text area box, you use the text area element. Now, you still, since this is in a form, should consider using the name attribute. We'll call it feedback, and you'll most likely need an ID. And we can also have an attribute of cols and rows. Cols are basically how many column characters do you want. So basically, how big do you want it across? So let's say, let's just say 50 for now. And then for rows is how tall you want it. So how many rows do you want in your text area box? So let's say 4. And then we'll play with it and see what happens. So once you close that, it has your text area here. Let's refresh it. Oh, no, let's add some breaks here so it won't be piled on top of each other. Okay, so this is what a text area box looks like. You can, as a user, resize this because the browser allows you to do that. And you can type as much as you want to. Even if it was much smaller, that content would still be sent to the server because it's still in that text box unless you set restrictions in your attributes, okay? But you could make it a lot smaller. So what if we only had 10 columns? It would look something like that. So columns, I know it's weird, it seems counterintuitive to me, but columns represent how wide it is and rows represent how tall it is. Now, if you wanted, I'm going to change this back to 50. If you wanted some placeholder text inside that, you could type it right here in between your text area tags. So let's say enter feedback here. And see how I typed it right in between those two text area tags. And if we refresh it, then it's going to appear there. Okay? But the user would have to take it out before they could type.